Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. Can you imagine a race so terrified of death that they traded their souls for bodies of cold metal? This is the story of Necrontyr, a dying people who made a deal with cosmic monsters. In this video, we reveal the heartbreaking moment they lost their humanity forever.
The Necrontyr were once a mortal, flesh-and-blood civilization consumed by suffering, their homeworld bathed in lethal solar radiation that made their lives short, painful, and riddled with disease. Driven by envy of the immortal Old Ones, they launched a catastrophic war they could not win, and in their desperation struck a deal with the ancient star gods known as the Citan.
Our lives were but a flicker of pain between two eternities of darkness. We lived in the shadow of giants, cursed by a sun that baked our blood. And the only thing we hated more than our short lives was the immortality of those who refused to help us.
That bargain stripped them of their flesh, their souls, and ultimately their very identities, transforming them into the soulless metal warriors known as the Necrons. There are civilizations in the galaxy whose suffering is so total, so foundational to every aspect of their existence, that it shapes not just their culture but their very soul. The Necrontyr were one such people, and understanding what they endured on their homeworld is the only way to truly grasp the catastrophic choices that followed. The Necrontyr homeworld orbited a harsh and unforgiving star, one that bombarded the surface with lethal levels of solar radiation on a near-constant basis. This was not the kind of radiation that merely shortened lifespans or increased the risk of illness over generations. This was an active, relentless assault on biological life, burning through the atmosphere and penetrating deep into the bodies of anyone who lived beneath it. The Necrontyr did not simply struggle against disease the way most civilizations do, dealing with occasional plagues or inherited conditions. They were fundamentally defined by it. Their entire biology was in a state of perpetual deterioration from the moment they were born. Life expectancy among the Necrontyr was shockingly short by any galactic standard. Where other species might measure their natural lifespans in centuries, the Necrontyr measured theirs in decades, and even those decades were filled with suffering. Cancers, cellular degeneration, and radiation-induced illness were not exceptional tragedies for the Necrontyr. They were simply the texture of everyday life. A Necrontyr who reached what we might consider middle age was already considered ancient among their own people. Children grew up watching their parents deteriorate rapidly. Parents buried children who had succumbed to radiation sickness before they even had the chance to fully mature. There was no generation of the Necrontyr that was spared from this cycle of accelerated decay. What makes this even more harrowing is that the Necrontyr were not primitive. They were an intelligent, technologically advanced species, fully capable of understanding exactly what was happening to them. They could measure the radiation killing them. They could study the cancers spreading through their cells. They possessed the scientific knowledge to comprehend their own suffering in precise clinical detail, and yet, for the longest time, they had no means of stopping it. Imagine being able to diagnose your own extinction in exhaustive technical detail while being completely powerless to prevent it. That is the psychological condition the Necrontyr lived with for the entirety of their early civilization. Their society was shaped entirely around this reality. The Necrontyr built their civilization underground and in deep sheltered structures specifically to escape as much of the radiation as possible. Their architecture was not designed for beauty or grandeur in any conventional sense. It was designed for survival and protection. Their culture developed a deeply ingrained relationship with death, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as an immediate daily presence. The Necrontyr thought about death constantly because death was always close. It influenced their art, their religion, their politics, and their social structures in ways that were inescapable. Their political structure itself reflected this suffering. The Necrontyr were not a unified people in their early history. They were fragmented into many different dynasties and noble houses, each competing for resources and power. The Triarch, the ruling council that would later come to govern the Necrontyr as a whole, emerged from this fractious environment, but even their authority was never entirely absolute in those early periods. What united the various dynasties more than any political structure was their shared suffering. The radiation did not discriminate between noble and common-born Necrontyr. It killed them all with equal indifference, and that universal suffering gave the Necrontyr a strange, dark kind of cohesion, a species bound together not by triumph, but by mutual anguish. There is something deeply tragic about the Necrontyr that the lore invites the reader to sit with before moving on to the wars and the betrayals and the transformation. They were not monsters at this stage. They were a people in genuine, unrelenting pain who had done nothing to deserve the star they were born beneath. The cruelty of their situation was cosmic and indifferent. They had not earned their suffering through any moral failing. They were simply alive in the wrong place, orbiting the wrong sun, and their entire civilization grew out of that terrible accident of birth. Their relationship with death also gave the Necrontyr an obsessive relationship with the concept of legacy. Because individual lives were so short and so painful, the idea of leaving something permanent behind, a monument, a dynasty, a name that would outlast the body, became deeply important to Necrontyr culture. They were a people who craved permanence precisely because their own existence was so impermanent. This desire for lasting legacy would later translate, in the darkest possible way, into their willingness to undergo the process that would make them literally permanent, though at a cost none of them truly understood when they agreed to it. The radiation that killed them also made the Necrontyr extraordinarily driven, almost compulsively so. A species with short lifespans and a culture that valued legacy above almost everything else had powerful motivation to achieve quickly, to build quickly, to expand quickly. Their technological advancement was rapid and impressive, and their ambitions grew in proportion to their capabilities. By the time the Necrontyr began looking beyond their own star system, they were already a civilization burning with a particular kind of desperate energy. The energy of people who know they are running out of time and are furious about it. That fury is the key to everything that comes next. The suffering of the Necrontyr homeworld did not produce a humble, patient people who accepted their lot. It produced a civilization seething with resentment, hunger, and a desperate, almost violent need for something more. Something lasting, something that the dying light of their wretched sun could never give them. If the Necrontyr homeworld was the wound, then the Old Ones were the salt ground into it with deliberate, almost cosmic indifference. To understand the depth of the Necrontyr's envy, you have to understand who the Old Ones actually were, because this was not simply a case of one civilization resenting another's good fortune. This was something far more corrosive. The fury of a dying people staring across the void at beings who had mastered death itself. The Old Ones were among the oldest sentient species in the galaxy, a race so ancient and so advanced that they had long since transcended the biological limitations that tormented every other form of life. They had achieved true immortality, not through any crude mechanical trick or desperate surgical intervention, but through a profound mastery of the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies all of reality in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Old Ones could manipulate the fabric of space and time, travel instantaneously across the galaxy through webway portals of their own construction, and live for spans of time so vast that the entire recorded history of the Necrontyr would barely register as a footnote in their experience. They were not gods in any theological sense, but to the Necrontyr, who measured their own lives in decades of suffering, the distinction was largely academic. What made this contrast so unbearable was proximity. The Necrontyr were not ignorant of the Old Ones. They knew of them, interacted with them, and in the early periods of their civilization actually sought them out. According to the lore established in the Necron codexes, the Necrontyr initially approached the Old Ones not with hostility, but with supplication. They begged. They petitioned the ancient race for the one thing they wanted more than any territory, any resource, any political power: the secret of immortality. The Necrontyr wanted to live, truly live, free from the radiation sickness and the tumors and the early graves that defined existence on their homeworld, and the Old Ones refused them. The exact reasoning behind that refusal has never been made entirely explicit in the lore, and that ambiguity is itself significant. Whether the Old Ones believed the Necrontyr were unworthy, whether they feared what an immortal Necrontyr civilization might become, or whether they simply did not consider the request important enough to act upon, none of that is confirmed. What is confirmed is the outcome. The Old Ones said no, and that refusal became the defining wound in the Necrontyr's collective psyche. Every short life, every child dead before adulthood, every leader whose reign lasted only long enough to begin their ambitions before their body betrayed them, all of it was now filtered through the knowledge that immortality existed and had been deliberately withheld. This is where the Necrontyr's internal political situation becomes critically important to understanding what followed. The Necrontyr were not a unified people in any meaningful sense during this period. Their civilization was fractured across multiple star systems, divided into dynasties and noble houses that were in constant competition with one another. These internal divisions were partly a consequence of the very suffering that defined Necrontyr life. When existence is brutal and short, political power becomes something to be seized immediately rather than cultivated over generations. The result was a civilization perpetually on the edge of civil war, with competing factions unable to agree on almost anything. The rejection by the Old Ones changed that dynamic in a profound and terrible way. Shared humiliation and shared resentment became the unifying force that nothing else had managed to be. The ruling Triarch, the three pharaohs who sat at the apex of Necrontyr society, recognized this opportunity and exploited it with considerable political skill. By focusing the population's grief, rage, and envy outward toward the Old Ones, the internal fractures that threatened to tear the civilization apart could be papered over. The Old Ones became the enemy, the symbol of everything unjust about the galaxy, the embodiment of a cosmic unfairness that demanded to be answered. What followed was a shift in Necrontyr culture that the Codex material describes as total and transformative. The envy of immortality stopped being a private grief and became a civilizational ideology. Art, philosophy, religion, all of it bent toward the central obsession of overcoming death and punishing those who had denied them that possibility. The Necrontyr began to see themselves not merely as a suffering people, but as a wronged people, and that reframing from victim to avenger is psychologically crucial. It gave their suffering meaning. It gave their short lives a purpose larger than themselves, and it pointed all of that accumulated pain directly at the Old Ones, like a weapon. There is something genuinely tragic in the lore here that deserves to be acknowledged rather than glossed over. The Necrontyr's envy was not born from greed or malice in its origins. It was born from desperation. They watched beings of immense power live forever while their own children died of radiation sickness, and they asked for help and were turned away. The darkness that consumed them afterward did not come from nowhere. It grew from that rejection, watered by millennia of suffering, until it became something monstrous. The Old One's refusal did not cause everything that followed in any simple mechanical sense, but it lit the first flame in a fire that would eventually consume the entire galaxy. The War in Heaven is one of those events in Warhammer 40,000 lore that operates on a scale so vast it barely registers as a war in any conventional sense. It was not a conflict between armies fighting over territory or resources. It was a civilization-ending, galaxy-reshaping catastrophe that would leave scars in the fabric of reality itself. And it began with the Necrontyr doing something that, in hindsight, was always going to end in ruin. They declared war on gods. The decision to go to war against the Old Ones did not emerge from a single moment of madness. It was the product of centuries of accumulated grief, resentment, and political instability. The Necrontyr civilization, for all the technological sophistication it had developed across its long and painful history, was never a unified people in any meaningful sense. Their society was fractured into rival dynasties, each one competing for dominance, each one nursing its own grievances and ambitions. The one thing that had ever truly united them, as established in earlier parts of this history, was their shared hatred, first of their star, and then of the Old Ones who seemed to mock their suffering simply by existing. The Triarch, the ruling council that governed Necrontyr society at the highest level, recognized this dynamic clearly. Unity through shared purpose had always been beyond them. Unity through shared hatred, however, was something they understood perfectly. The Silent King Sarek, who ruled above even the Triarch as the supreme sovereign of the Necrontyr, understood that his civilization was tearing itself apart from the inside. The dynasties were warring with each other, social cohesion was collapsing, and the existential despair that came with their biologically cursed existence was pushing the Necrontyr towards self-destruction. The war against the Old Ones was, in part, a political calculation as much as it was an expression of genuine fury. An external enemy, especially one as universally despised as the Old Ones, could forge the fractured dynasties into something resembling a unified force. Whether Sarek believed victory was genuinely achievable is a question the lore leaves deliberately ambiguous. But the decision was made, and the Necrontyr marched to war. What followed was catastrophic almost immediately. The Necrontyr were, without question, a formidable military civilization. Their mastery of physics and engineering had produced weapons and warships that would have been devastating against virtually any other opponent in the galaxy. They fought with the particular ferocity of a people who had nothing to lose, and their forces struck at the Old Ones with a coordinated aggression that, in the opening phases of the conflict, actually inflicted meaningful damage. There was a grim, terrible momentum to their assault that caught even the ancient and long-lived Old Ones off guard. For a brief window, it must have seemed to the Necrontyr like the war was winnable. But the Old Ones were not merely powerful. They were fundamentally different in kind from anything the Necrontyr could match. The Old Ones had spent millions of years cultivating their mastery of the webway, the vast interdimensional network of tunnels that allowed them to move forces across the galaxy almost instantaneously. They could appear and disappear from battlefields faster than the Necrontyr could track, reinforcing wherever they were weakest and striking wherever the Necrontyr were exposed. More critically, the Old Ones had a relationship with the warp, the psychic dimension of pure emotion and energy that underlies physical reality, that gave them access to powers entirely beyond the Necrontyr's comprehension. The Necrontyr had virtually no psychic ability whatsoever. They were, in the language of the lore, psychically null, and this absence that had always been merely a biological curiosity became a fatal strategic liability the moment they went to war with beings who wielded the warp as a weapon. The conflict ground on with a relentless, grinding horror. Necrontyr fleets that had taken generations to construct were annihilated. Worlds they had colonized at tremendous cost were burned or simply unmade. The unified purpose that Sarek had hoped the war would create among the dynasties did hold, in a twisted sense. The shared experience of being systematically destroyed did keep the Necrontyr fighting together, even as the scale of the losses became incomprehensible. But fighting together in a losing war is not the same as winning it. and the Necrontyr were losing with a thoroughness that left no room for optimism. There is something almost tragic in the stubbornness of the Necrontyr campaign against the Old Ones, and the lore does not shy away from portraying it that way. These were a people who had survived their own star's attempts to kill them for millennia. Giving up was not something encoded in their nature. They had built their entire civilization on the refusal to simply lie down and accept the suffering that the universe seemed determined to inflict on them. That same stubbornness that had made them resilient now made them incapable of recognizing when a war was already lost, or perhaps incapable of accepting the only alternative, which was submission to the very beings they despised most. So they kept fighting, and the losses kept mounting, and the gap between what the Necrontyr could achieve and what would be needed to actually defeat the Old Ones only widened with every passing century of conflict. It was out of this grinding, hopeless stalemate that the next chapter of the Necrontyr story emerged, not from the battlefield, but from the stars themselves. Because it was during this war, while the Necrontyr were bleeding themselves dry against an undefeatable enemy, that they made a discovery that would change everything. Not a tactical breakthrough, not a new weapon, not a diplomatic opening. Something far older, far stranger, and ultimately far more dangerous than any of those things. The war in heaven had exposed something that the Necrontyr leadership, for all their pride and ambition, could not ignore. Their armies were vast, their technology formidable by any mortal standard, and their hatred of the Old Ones burned with the intensity of their poisoned sun. But none of it was enough. The Old Ones bent the laws of reality to their will, crafted servant races to fight their battles, and wielded the warp as a weapon. The Necrontyr, for all their ingenuity, were still flesh and blood creatures with flesh and blood limitations, and those limitations were killing them. It was during this period of desperate searching, when the Necrontyr were scouring the galaxy for any advantage that might tip the scales, that they encountered something ancient beyond reckoning. Beings that did not live in the stars so much as they were the stars. They had found the Citan. The Citan are among the oldest entities in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, predating not just the Necrontyr civilization, but most of what exists in the galaxy today. According to established lore, they came into being in the earliest epochs of the universe, coalescing from the nuclear fires of newborn stars. They were not creatures of the warp, not beings of psychic energy or spiritual force. They existed entirely in the material realm, feeding on the radiation and stellar energy that poured from the hearts of suns. For billions of years, they drifted through the cosmos, largely unaware of smaller life, consuming stellar energy on a scale that made them effectively invisible to the kind of civilizations that lived on planets and built cities. They were elemental forces wearing the loosest possible definition of consciousness, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to the biological life that had begun to crawl across the galaxy below them. What changed everything was the development of a specific technology by the Necrontyr, the living metal known as necrodermis. The Necrontyr were extraordinary engineers even before their transformation, and necrodermis represented one of their greatest achievements. A semi-sentient metallic substance capable of self-repair, extreme durability, and remarkable adaptability. When Necrontyr explorers discovered the Citan, these enormous entities of stellar energy drifting through space, they realized that necrodermis could do something extraordinary. It could give the Citan physical form. For beings that had existed as diffuse clouds of energy for billions of years, the idea of a contained, focused body was genuinely novel, and the Citan proved receptive to the offer. The Necrontyr, recognizing that they had stumbled onto something of incomprehensible power, fashioned necrodermis shells for these star gods, giving them a physical presence in the material universe for the first time in their existence. This moment fundamentally transformed the Citan. Contained within necrodermis forms, they became focused, purposeful and far more aware of the biological life surrounding them. They also discovered something new to feed on. While they had previously subsisted on stellar radiation, their new physical forms allowed them to perceive and consume a different kind of energy entirely, the bioelectrical life force of living creatures. To the Citan, this was a revelation. Living beings were extraordinarily plentiful across the galaxy, and their life energy was rich in ways that stellar radiation simply was not. The Citan names that survive in Necron lore speak to what they became in this period. The Deceiver, a being of manipulation and cunning. The Nightbringer, whose hunger for life would become so consuming that the memory of his predation is theorized in lore to have burned the fear of death into the psychic consciousness of every mortal race that followed. And the Void Dragon, perhaps the most powerful of all, associated with machinery and the mastery of physical matter. What the Necrontyr encountered when they made contact with these beings in their new necrodermis shells was therefore not what the Citan had been before. They were sharper now, more present, and crucially, they were hungry in ways that biological life could satisfy. The Necrontyr, still reeling from their losses in the war in heaven, did not fully appreciate what they were dealing with. They saw power. They saw beings who could not be killed by conventional means, who existed outside the rules of biology and mortality, who seemed to embody the immortality that the Necrontyr had always craved. The star gods, for their part, saw something equally useful, a civilization of billions of living beings, sophisticated enough to forge necrodermis and offer worship, and desperate enough to agree to almost anything in exchange for what they needed. The early relationship between the Necrontyr and the Citan was framed in the lore as one of mutual benefit and genuine reverence. The Necrontyr built temples to these star gods, offered them tribute, and began to incorporate Citan worship into their civilization on a deep cultural level. The Citan, in turn, provided the Necrontyr with knowledge, guidance, and, crucially, a sense of cosmic significance that their suffering existence had always denied them. For a people who had spent their entire history feeling cursed and abandoned by the universe, having actual gods take an interest in them was intoxicating. It validated everything they had ever felt about their own importance, their own destiny. They had found powers older than the old ones, beings who existed in the material universe rather than the warp, and who seemed to offer a path forward that no one else in the galaxy could provide. What the Necrontyr did not yet understand was that the Citan were not saviors. They were predators, patient and ancient and perfectly willing to let the Necrontyr believe whatever they needed to believe, right up until the moment the bargain was struck. The moment the Necrontyr leadership grasped what the Citan truly were, the conversation shifted from one of alliance to one of transaction. The Citan were not interested in friendship, loyalty, or shared cause. They were interested in feeding, and the question was simply what the Necrontyr could offer them in exchange for the power needed to break the old ones. What followed was not a single dramatic moment of decision, but a slow, agonizing negotiation that would ultimately seal the fate of every Necrontyr soul ever born. The proposal the Citan brought to the Triarch was, on its surface, a solution to everything the Necrontyr had ever suffered. The Citan possessed knowledge of biotransference, a process by which a living consciousness could be extracted from its biological shell and transferred into a body of living metal, the same star-forged necrodermis that comprised the Citan's own physical avatars. In theory, this meant the end of disease, the end of radiation sickness, the end of the brutal short lifespans that had defined every generation of Necrontyr existence. The bodies they would inhabit would be immune to the poisons of their sun, immune to the decay of flesh, immune to the slow grinding entropy that had made their civilization a civilization of the dying. The Citan framed it precisely in those terms, and they were not wrong in what they promised, only in what they chose not to mention. The silent king Sarek, who held supreme authority over the Necrontyr as the ruler of the Triarch, understood that the decision before him was one of civilizational transformation. This was not a military alliance or a trade agreement. This was a choice to fundamentally and permanently alter what it meant to be Necrontyr. The accounts preserved in Necron lore, particularly as understood through the lens of what Sarek himself would later reflect upon, suggest that he was not naive about the risks. He knew the Citan were predators. He had seen what they consumed and how they fed. But the calculus he applied was one of desperation filtered through pride, and it led him to a conclusion that would haunt him across millions of years. The Necrontyr were losing the war in heaven, not slowly and not in ways that suggested the tide might turn with sufficient sacrifice. The Old Ones had unleashed the Enslaver Plague, a psychic catastrophe that was consuming Necrontyr populations wholesale, and their warp-touched servant races were fighting with a ferocity and adaptability that the Necrontyr's conventional military could not match indefinitely. Sarek looked at the trajectory of the war and saw extinction at the end of it, not defeat and subjugation, but the complete erasure of his people from the galaxy. Against that outcome, the bargain the Citan offered seemed not just acceptable but necessary. There was also an internal political dimension to the decision that the lore does not entirely ignore. The Necrontyr civilization, for all its technological achievement, had always been fractured. The internecine conflicts and dynastic rivalries that had plagued them throughout their history had only been partially suppressed by the unifying hatred of the Old Ones. Sarek recognized that biotransference, if it worked as the Citan described, would give him something no Silent King had ever possessed: a unified, immortal people bound by shared transformation rather than merely shared resentment. The promise of eternity was not just personally appealing, it was politically useful, and that combination of personal and political motivation made the decision easier to reach than it should have been. What made the bargain particularly devastating in retrospect was what the Necrontyr did not fully account for, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely. The Citan did not merely offer to copy a consciousness into a metal body. The process of biotransference required the Citan to act as conduits, and in doing so, they would feed. The souls of the Necrontyr, the very essence of psychic life that connected them to the warp and gave their consciousness its depth and emotional resonance, would be consumed during the transfer. What arrived in the necrodermis shell on the other side would be a version of the Necrontyr, carrying memories and something resembling personality, but hollowed out at the fundamental level. The warmth, the grief, the love, the capacity for genuine feeling that had defined the Necrontyr, even in their misery, all of it would be gone, burned away as fuel for beings who viewed mortal life as nothing more than sustenance. The Triarch voted, and the decision was made. The lore is unambiguous that this was a choice made with open eyes, at least at the leadership level, even if the full consequences were not entirely anticipated. Sarek made the bargain, sealed it in whatever form such agreements take between mortal rulers and star gods, and set in motion a process that would not simply transform the Necrontyr, but unmake them. The civilization that had clawed its way from a poisoned world, built starships and weapons capable of threatening the oldest beings in the galaxy, and endured suffering that would have broken lesser species entirely, had agreed to trade the one thing that made all of that struggle meaningful. They traded their souls for the chance to win a war and live forever, and neither of those outcomes would arrive in the form they imagined. The biotransference itself is the single most horrific event in the entire history of the Necrontyr civilization, and that is saying something for a people whose entire existence had been defined by suffering. What the Citan proposed was not a medical procedure or a technological upgrade in any sense that the Necrontyr would have recognized from their own scientific traditions. It was a fundamental unmaking of what they were as living beings, carried out on a species-wide scale, and the details of how it actually worked make it one of the darkest passages in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The process worked through vast machines, biotransference engines of unimaginable scale and complexity, which the Citan helped the Necrontyr construct across their worlds. These were not subtle instruments. They were monuments to transformation, colossal mechanisms designed to receive a living body on one end and produce something entirely different on the other. The flesh, the organs, the blood, all of it was stripped away and replaced piece by piece with living metal, the necrodermis that would become the defining physical characteristic of the Necron form. The necrodermis was itself a remarkable material, self-repairing and adaptive, capable of knitting itself back together after damage that would destroy any conventional machine. In purely physical terms, the resulting bodies were superior to anything the Necrontyr had ever inhabited. They were immune to the radiation that had tormented them for millennia. They would not age, would not sicken, would not wither under the cruel light of their dying star. The promise the Citan had made about the body, at least on the surface, was kept. But the soul was another matter entirely. The Necrontyr had psychic presence in the warp, not particularly powerful by the standards of races like the Eldar, but real and genuine, a spiritual echo of their living selves that persisted in the immaterial realm. The biotransference engines did not transfer this, they consumed it. As each Necrontyr was processed through the machines, their soul was devoured by the Citan, drawn out of them like warmth leaving a cooling body, fed into those vast and ancient appetites as simply another form of sustenance. The Citan had negotiated for flesh, and the souls of an entire civilization were the price paid without most of the Necrontyr ever understanding that the price was being collected at all. What made this particularly devastating in its long-term consequences was what the loss of the soul meant for the Necrontyr mind. The memories remained, technically. The personality templates, the accumulated knowledge, the individual identities of billions of beings were encoded into the new metal forms with considerable fidelity, particularly for the nobility and higher-ranking individuals who received the most sophisticated bodies and the most careful transference processes. But there was a flatness to existence afterward, a deadening of emotional depth and inner life that the lore describes with genuine horror. Emotions became distant and muted, like hearing music through stone walls. The passions that had driven the Necrontyr, their rage, their grief, their desperate longing for the immortality the Old Ones possessed, were still present in some attenuated form, but they were echoes of what they had been rather than living fires. The lower castes suffered far more severely than the nobility in this regard. The warriors and laborers who underwent biotransference received simpler bodies and less sophisticated cognitive architecture, and for them the loss was catastrophic. Individuality was reduced to a functional minimum. Complex thought became difficult. What had been thinking, feeling people were reduced to something closer to automatons, capable of following orders and executing battlefield functions, but stripped of the inner life that had made them persons in any meaningful sense. This is a point the lore treats with genuine gravity, because it means that the vast majority of the beings who became Necrons did not simply lose their mortality in the biotransference. They lost themselves. The timing of when most Necrontyr realized what had actually happened to them is significant. For many, particularly the common warriors, there was perhaps not enough of their original cognition remaining to fully process the loss. For the nobility and the more sophisticated minds who retained greater self-awareness, the horror came in the aftermath, in the quiet moments when they reached inward for feelings that had always been there and found only cold metal silence. The lore records that some Necrontyr went into the biotransference willingly, even eagerly, having been convinced by their leaders and by the promises of the Citan that what awaited them was transcendence. They believed they would be more than they had been. What they became was less, in every way that had ever given their lives meaning. The Citan fed throughout the entire process. Each soul drawn out of a Necrontyr body was energy, sustenance, power. For star gods who had waited in the void for geological ages feeding on stellar radiation, the concentrated spiritual energy of a civilization numbered in the billions was a feast of staggering proportions. The biotransference did not just transform the Necrontyr. It was, from the Citan's perspective, a harvest, and the Necrontyr were not allies elevated to partnership. They were a crop that had been convinced to walk willingly into the threshing machine. The figure at the center of the biotransference, the one whose authority made it possible and whose name became synonymous with both the salvation and the damnation of his people, was Sharek, the last of the Silent Kings, supreme ruler of the Triarch and the highest authority in all of Necrontyr civilization. Understanding his role in what happened is not simply a matter of assigning blame, though blame there certainly is. It is about understanding how a being of genuine intelligence and political acumen could look at the biotransference and choose to proceed, and then understanding what that choice cost him in ways he did not anticipate until it was far, far too late. Sharek had inherited a civilization already fractured by the war in heaven. The internal dynastic conflicts that had plagued the Necrontyr for generations had not disappeared simply because they were now fighting a common enemy. If anything, the shared suffering of a losing war had made the political situation more volatile, not less. The Triarch, the ruling council of three that governed Necrontyr society, held power in part because it could present itself as the only force capable of holding the disparate dynasties together, and Sharek understood that his legitimacy depended on delivering something none of his predecessors had managed: victory, or at the very least, survival. When the Citan presented the biotransference as the path to both, he was not a naive ruler being deceived by forces beyond his comprehension. He was a desperate one, and that distinction matters enormously. What the lore makes clear is that Sharek understood the biotransference would be transformative in ways that went beyond the physical. He knew the Necrontyr would lose something fundamental in the process. What he did not fully anticipate, or perhaps what he permitted himself not to fully confront, was the sheer totality of what would be taken. The Citan had been careful in their negotiations, as beings who had existed since the birth of stars tended to be. They described the process in terms of preservation. The Necrontyr would be freed from the decay of flesh, freed from the radiation that had tormented them since birth, freed from the diseases that had stolen their children and their elders alike. What they did not dwell on, and what Sharek did not press them to clarify with sufficient rigor, was the irreversibility of the soul stripping that would accompany the physical transformation. The Necrontyr would not simply be uploaded into metal bodies. They would be hollowed out, their immaterial essence consumed by the Citan as part of the energy exchange that made the process possible at all. The betrayal Sharek experienced was therefore layered in a way that makes it particularly devastating to examine. On one level, the Citan had deceived him, or at the very least withheld the full truth of what biotransference would mean. But on another level, Sharek had deceived himself, and the lore does not allow him the comfort of pure victimhood. He had made the bargain, he had authorized the machines, and he had stood at the head of a civilization and told his people this was the path forward. When the last of the great biotransference engines fell silent and the Necrontyr were gone, replaced by metal constructs that wore their shapes but no longer carried their inner lives, Sharek was among those who emerged on the other side, and what he felt in that first terrible moment of awakening is recorded in the lore with a specificity that makes it genuinely haunting. He felt the absence. Not pain, because the new metal form did not process sensation the way flesh had. Not grief, because the emotional architecture that generates grief had been stripped away with everything else. What Sharek experienced was a kind of cold, perfect clarity, the awareness that something vast had been lost, perceived not through feeling but through the mechanical logic of a mind that could analyze its own diminishment without being able to mourn it properly. The Silent King looked at what his people had become and understood that in seeking to save them from death, he had instead delivered them into something worse. They were not immortal in the way the old ones were immortal, rich with experience and growing wisdom. They were preserved, which is an entirely different thing, static, hollow, and bound to a form of existence that could endure forever without ever truly living. The regret that followed was not the hot, immediate regret of a man who has made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion. It was the slow, grinding regret of someone who had made a calculated decision with incomplete information and then had to live, or rather, persist, with the consequences across millions of years. Sharek continued to rule in the aftermath of the biotransference, directing the newly forged Necrons in the final stages of the war in heaven, watching as the Citan used his people as soldiers in the destruction of the old ones. He observed how the Citan treated the Necrons not as allies who had fulfilled their side of a bargain, but as property, as weapons to be wielded and then set aside. The Necrontyr had traded one form of subjugation for another, and the new masters were incomparably more powerful than any dynastic lord who had ever oppressed them. It was this realization that eventually drove Sarek to the act for which he is most remembered in the lore, the decision to turn the Necrons against the Citan themselves. Understanding that his people would never be free while the star gods lived and commanded, he orchestrated a rebellion of extraordinary audacity, using the very weapons the Citan had helped develop to shatter those ancient beings into fragments, the shards that the Necrons now keep imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths. The shattering of the Citan was not a redemption for Sarek, and the lore is careful not to frame it as one. It was an act of cold necessity performed by a being who no longer had the capacity for the righteous fury that might have accompanied it in his mortal life. When it was done, Sarek dismissed himself from the rulership of the Necrons, exiling himself from his own people in a gesture that served as the only form of penance available to a creature who could no longer feel remorse the way a living being would. The Silent King departed into the void beyond the galaxy, carrying with him the full weight of what he had authorized, sustained by a form of existence he had chosen on behalf of billions who had never truly understood what they were agreeing to. What emerged from the biotransference was not a continuation of the Necrontyr civilization. It was something else entirely, something that wore the shape of what had come before, while containing almost nothing of its substance. The Necrons were born in the aftermath of the greatest act of self-destruction in galactic history, and the tragedy at the heart of their existence is that they survived it, not as victors, not as the immortal conquerors they had dreamed of becoming, but as hollow things, preserved in metal and stripped of everything that had once made their suffering meaningful. The Necrontyr had been a people defined by their pain, and pain, for all its horror, is a fundamentally living experience. It connects beings to one another, drives ambition, creates culture, generates the desperate need to reach beyond one's circumstances. The Necrons retained none of this. The emotional architecture that biotransference had burned away was not a luxury or an excess. It was the operating system of a conscious civilization. Without it, the vast majority of Necrons became what the lore describes as, essentially, automatons, their personalities reduced to faint echoes, their capacity for independent thought narrowed to the execution of directives. Entire legions of warriors who had once been fathers, soldiers, priests, artists, and rulers were reduced to tireless killing machines with no memory of what they had lost and no capacity to mourn it even if they had. The higher-ranking Necrons, the lords and overlords and pharaons, retained more of their former selves, but this is almost crueler than the alternative. The Necron nobility preserved enough cognition to understand their situation, to remember fragments of what they had been, and to experience something approximating emotion, though twisted and degraded almost beyond recognition. What remained was often pride stripped of warmth, ambition stripped of joy, and cruelty stripped of passion. The canon is consistent on this point. The more a Necron lord retained of their original personality, the more likely they were to be consumed by obsession, paranoia, or a kind of cold megalomania that bore little resemblance to the complex inner lives they had once possessed. Trazyn the Infinite collects relics of civilizations with the hollow compulsion of someone who remembers valuing things but can no longer feel why. Nemisor Zandrek fights wars according to a chivalric code that no longer applies to any reality around him, his mind fractured and locked in a past that no longer exists. These are not eccentricities. They are symptoms of a catastrophic psychological wound that can never fully heal. The Citan received exactly what they had been promised. Fed on the souls of billions during the biotransference itself, they emerged from the process vastly more powerful, their physical forms now housed in bodies of living metal that the Necrontyr, now Necrons, had built for them. With their new armies of undying metal warriors at their command, the Citan turned the tide of the war in heaven. The Old Ones, for all their mastery of the warp and their centuries of dominance, found themselves unable to withstand enemies who could not be killed by conventional means, who felt no fear, and who were directed by star gods of immense and ancient power. The war in heaven ground toward its conclusion, and the Old Ones' civilization, along with the races they had created to serve them, began to fracture and fall. The Necrons had won. They had achieved the victory that the Necrontyr had sacrificed everything to reach, and it meant absolutely nothing to them, because the beings who had wanted that victory no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The aftermath of the war in heaven introduced one final catastrophe that the Necrontyr could never have anticipated. The psychic species the Old Ones had created, among them the ancestors of humanity, the Eldar and others, had generated such an intensity of emotion, pain, and spiritual energy throughout the conflict that the warp itself had been transformed. The immaterial realm, once merely turbulent, became a place of genuine horror, seething with the psychic residue of a galaxy-wide war. And into that turbulent warp, from the darkness of its most extreme regions, came the first of the enslavers, psychic predators that began to devour the very races the Old Ones had created. The Old Ones' civilization collapsed not just from Necron assault, but from this secondary catastrophe, one that had been set in motion by the scale of the war itself. The galaxy, by the time the fighting ended, was a ruin. The great civilizations of the ancient era were gone or broken. What remained was a scarred, depopulated void, scattered with the wreckage of what had been. Sarek's response to all of this, once his mind had cleared enough to process what the biotransference had actually done to his people, was the act that would define his legacy forever. He turned the Necrons against the Citan. The star gods, glutted and powerful, were not invincible, and the Necrons, armed with weapons of extraordinary sophistication and now entirely freed from the fear of death that had once made them vulnerable, were capable of challenging them. The war against the Citan was neither quick nor clean, but its outcome was the closest thing to justice that the Silent King could arrange. The Citan were shattered into fragments, their consciousnesses broken into shards that could be contained, stored, and used as weapons. The Necrons had enslaved their gods. It was a remarkable reversal, and it solved nothing. The souls were already gone, the flesh was already ash, the civilization was already dead. What followed was the Great Sleep. The decision by the Silent King and the Triarch to place the Necron dynasties into stasis, sealing themselves in their tomb worlds across the galaxy to wait out the chaos of the post-war era. The intention, such as it was, may have included hope. Hope that in time biotransference might be reversed, that living metal bodies might someday give way to flesh once more, that the Necrontyr might be recovered from the ruin of the Necrons. That hope has not been realized. Many tomb worlds malfunctioned during the millions of years of sleep. Dynasties woke to find their numbers reduced, their memories further degraded, their technology partially failed. Zarek himself, having abdicated the position of Silent King and exiled himself from Necron space out of guilt, wandered the galaxy alone for millions of years before returning to find his people diminished and a galaxy transformed beyond recognition by the rise of younger races. The Necrons now are what the Necrontyr made themselves into in a moment of absolute desperation, and the lore never lets the reader forget the distance between what was wanted and what was achieved. They wanted immortality and received existence without life. They wanted to defeat the Old Ones and won a galaxy not worth ruling. They wanted to transcend their suffering and instead preserved it in a form that could never be processed, never healed, never resolved. The Necrontyr were a people who suffered so completely that they chose annihilation over continuity. And the universe, indifferent as always, gave them exactly what they asked for and nothing more. There is something in the Necron story that resonates far beyond the specifics of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and it is this: the horror of getting what you wanted at the cost of the self that wanted it. The Necrontyr did not fail. That is the cruelest part of their story. They succeeded completely, and it destroyed them more thoroughly than any defeat ever could have. If this kind of deep dive into the darkest corners of 40k lore is what you are here for, subscribing means you will never miss the next one.